Oh? You're not my real mother. The words cracked through the warm air like ice snapping on the lake outside. I froze, my fork hovering above the slice of pumpkin pie I'd barely touched. The cinnamon, sweet steam curled upward, but all I could smell was the sharp sting of humiliation. Claire stood at the far end of the long oak table, her wine glass trembling slightly in her hand. Her voice had that brittle edge I knew too well, the one she used when she wanted to draw blood without leaving a mark. Across from her, Daniel leaned back in his chair, smirking as if this scene had been rehearsed. My eyes drifted to the frosted window. Beyond it, the lake was a sheet of silver, the wind brushing ripples across its frozen skin. This house, my house, had held every Thanksgiving since Patrick and I bought it. The table we sat around now was the same one he sanded and stained with his own hands. Yet in that moment, it felt like foreign territory. The room went quiet except for the faint pop of the fire in the stone hearth. Even the old clock above the mantel seemed to hold its breath. "Claire," I said slowly, feeling the eyes of our few guests flick between us. "What exactly do you mean by that?" She took a long sip of wine, her gaze fixed on me as if testing how far she could push. "Just that, you're not really my mother anymore? Not in the ways that matter?" Daniel's hand found hers under the table. He didn't need to speak, his smirk said enough. I felt the words lodge in my chest, cold and heavy. Not my real mother. As if decades of scraped knees, bedtime stories, and holiday mornings had been erased by some invisible hand. The scent of roasted turkey still lingered in the air, mixed with the bitter tang of coffee cooling in cups. Outside, a loon called once over the lake, the sound low and mournful. I laid my fork down gently, the silver ringing softly against the china. "I see," I murmured. In truth, I had seen this coming for years. Daniel had been edging me out since the day he married Claire. It started with small exclusions, not inviting me to birthdays because things were tight, suggesting I skip family trips to save me the hassle. Then came the bigger cuts, holidays celebrated without me, decisions made about my life in rooms I wasn't welcome to enter. Still, hearing my own child make it official before a table full of witnesses carved deeper than I expected. From the corner of my eye, I caught little Hannah watching me, her small hands curled around the arms of her chair. My granddaughter's eyes were wide, uncertain. She didn't understand this kind of warfare yet, but she could feel the temperature in the room drop. I gave her a small smile, the kind you use to steady a frightened animal. "Maybe we should get back to dinner," Daniel said lightly, reaching for the gravy boat. His tone was casual, but his eyes glittered with victory. I leaned back in my chair, letting the conversation flow past me. The clink of cutlery, the low murmur of side talk, the occasional burst of forced laughter, it all sounded distant, muffled. Beneath the table, my hands rested in my lap, fingers finding each other, lacing tight. My mind wasn't on the turkey or the pie. It was on the sealed manila envelope in my locked desk drawer upstairs. The one with the deed, the statements, the instructions no one at this table knew existed. I thought of Patrick's voice, low and steady, the last time we sat on the porch together. "Don't let them take what we built, Maggie." The memory was a coal in my chest, warming me against the chill. Claire laughed at something Daniel whispered. I noticed the way her shoulders relaxed when she wasn't looking at me. I noticed how easily they could erase me from the picture. They had no idea the picture was about to change. I reached for my coffee, took a slow sip, and let my eyes sweep the room. The pine garland over the mantel, the brass candlesticks, the flicker of the firelight against the old family photos on the wall. Each detail anchored me. This was my ground, and I had no intention of leaving it in their hands. Would anyone like more pie? I asked suddenly, my voice bright enough to make Daniel glance up in suspicion. Claire shook her head, already turning to refill her glass. Hannah raised her hand shyly. I stood, gathering plates, moving with the quiet efficiency I'd perfected over years of being underestimated. In the kitchen, the air was cooler, the hum of the old refrigerator filling the space. I set the plates down, rested my hands on the counter, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. They thought they had delivered the final blow tonight. They thought this would break me. They were wrong. This wasn't an ending. It was the opening move. If you were told you weren't really family at a holiday table, would you speak up or stay silent? The scent of cinnamon rolls still pulls me back. Thanksgiving morning, 1987, my kitchen was warm, crowded, alive. The radio hummed soft country tunes. I moved between stove and oven, hands dusted in flour, heart swelling every time my kids laughed from the living room. Back then, love felt simple: cook, care, keep everyone together. I was 30 back then, working double shifts at the diner and bringing home tips in a mason jar. Every dollar went into that jar until we had enough for the down payment on this very house. The siding was worn. The roof leaked in spring, but it was ours. My hands, cracked from detergent, had built a home from scratch, brick by brick, choice by choice. There were Christmas mornings when I'd stay up until 3 a.m., wrapping thrift store finds in bright paper so the kids wouldn't feel the difference between our budget and the glossy catalog pages their friends showed off. Watching their eyes light up was my richest reward. I remember one rainy Tuesday in '94, my son had strep throat. I called in sick, losing a day's wages, to sit by his bed and spoon warm broth into his stubborn mouth. "You'll get better?" I whispered, brushing damp hair from his forehead. He clung to my hand like I was the only safe thing in the world. Years slid by, seasons turning. I was there for every scraped knee, every broken heart. I patched jeans, baked pies, sat through freezing bleachers to watch baseball games where he barely played. I never missed, not once. When my husband passed in 2008, I didn't crumble. I picked up more shifts, cut my own expenses, and paid off the mortgage 5 years early. People said, "You're strong, Margaret." But strength was never a choice. It was the only option. And yet now, the laughter in this house is different. Quieter when I enter. At last Thanksgiving, I brought out the same cinnamon rolls. No one noticed. No one asked. My daughter-in-law scrolled her phone at the table. My son carved turkey without meeting my eyes. Sometimes I wonder if all those years were invisible. Did the warm pies, the sleepless nights, the mortgage I carried alone mean anything? Or were they just background noise to lives too busy to remember? I can still see the little boy with flushed cheeks clutching my hand. But when I look across the table now, I only see a man who avoids my gaze. And that's when the question began to gnaw. If they've forgotten everything I gave, what's stopping me from deciding what I give next? The snow had just started to fall, soft and lazy, tapping against the kitchen window. I was rinsing dishes, warm water fogging my glasses, when the front door opened. Lauder spilled in, my son Mark and his wife Eliza. They carried shopping bags, the kind from the upscale store downtown. Eliza's heels clicked across the hardwood. She didn't glance at me as she brushed past, perfume trailing in a sharp, citrus wave. Mark kissed my cheek. "Hey, Mom! We're just here to grab a few things." Eliza was already in the dining room, setting one glossy bag on the table I'd refinished myself years ago. I dried my hands, stepped in to offer tea. "It's cold out. Want me to make some?" She cut me off without looking up. "No, thanks. We're good." Mark shifted uncomfortably, but stayed silent. I noticed the faint dust on the table's edge and reached for a cloth, old habit. Before my hand touched the wood, Eliza's voice came, sweet but edged like glass. "You really don't have to clean, Margaret. I mean, you've done enough. This isn't your house anymore." The words hung there, light as snow but heavy as stone. I froze, cloth in hand. "Excuse me." She looked up then, eyes cool, a smile playing on her lips. "I just mean, you shouldn't worry yourself. You've lived here long enough. We'll take it from here." Mark cleared his throat. "Eliza." But she kept going, her tone casual, like discussing the weather. "We've been talking about redecorating, making it ours." She gestured toward the curtains I'd sewn one winter night after Patrick fell asleep early. "These are, well, a bit dated." I stared at those curtains, my stitches, my fabric, my hours, the hum of the sewing machine in the quiet house while snow piled outside. Inside my chest, something uncoiled, slow, hot. I thought, not your house? Since when? My fingers tightened around the cloth. I could feel the texture of worn cotton, smell the faint scent of lemon cleaner. The fire in the living room crackled, oblivious. I wanted to say everything at once. About the down payment, the repairs, the mortgage payments that ate up decades of my life. But I didn't, not yet. Instead, I folded the cloth neatly, set it on the table. "Redecorating?" I repeated, letting the word taste bitter on my tongue. Eliza smiled wider, sensing something. "Yes, a fresh start." Mark busied himself with the bags, pulling out a silver-framed mirror, new cushions. He didn't meet my eyes. The wind picked up outside, rattling the window. The sound seemed to echo in my bones. I stepped back, hands clasped loosely now, my voice even. "I see. Well, I hope you get exactly what you're planning for." Her brow twitched, just for a second. As they moved into the living room, chattering about paint colors, I stayed in the doorway. My gaze traveled over the room. The sofa Patrick and I bought secondhand, the shelves he built, the faint ring on the coffee table from a mug of cocoa Mark spilled at 10 years old. They wanted to erase all of it. I began to make a list in my head, not of the things they wanted gone, but of the things they didn't know existed: the deed, the investment accounts, the documents that kept this house in my name. The snow outside thickened, swirling under the streetlight. Elisa's laughter floated in from the other room, bright and hollow. I turned back to the sink, running the water hot again, steam rising. My reflection in the darkened window looked calm, almost serene. But inside, I was setting every piece of the board. They thought this was just about curtains. They were wrong. This was the first move in a game they didn't know had started. The first snow had hardened into a crust of ice along the driveway. I just returned from the grocery store, arms aching from the bags, when I noticed the corner of a manila envelope sticking out from under the stack of mail on the hall table. It was addressed to Mark, but the return label was from a law office in town. I should have left it there. But something in the careful, blocky font, the way the flap had been sealed and then taped, pulled at me. I slipped it free, my pulse quickening. Inside was a set of printed pages, dense paragraphs, bold headings. The title read Transfer of Property Agreement. My name was there, second line, under current owner. The next lines made my skin prickle. Proposed transfer of ownership from Margaret Doyle to Mark and Eliza Doyle, joint tenants. No date filled in, but signatures lines waiting, one for me, one for them. I stood in the hallway, bag of apples digging into my wrist, reading each clause. They drafted a plan to put the lake house entirely in their names. In return, no payment, no conditions, just a line about streamlining family assets. A car passed outside, tires crunching on ice. The sound snapped me back. I slid the papers into the envelope, tucked it under the mail where I'd found it. My hands were trembling. I took the groceries to the kitchen, the air suddenly too warm, my coat still on. Setting the bag down, I caught sight of my old leather ledger on the shelf, the one Patrick and I had used to balance every bill, every loan payment. An urge hit me hard, checked the accounts. I pulled the ledger down, turned to the back where I'd noted the savings account we opened decades ago. The account was technically joint. Patrick and I had kept it for emergencies, untouched since he passed. I still received quarterly statements by mail. I went to my desk, rifling through the drawer until I found the last envelope from the bank. The balance was wrong. Several thousand less than it should have been. Flipping through the pages, I saw the transactions, 2 withdrawals, each just under the limit that required dual authorization. Dates from the past 2 months. The pit in my stomach deepened. I could picture Elisa's manicured nails on the bank pen, Mark looking away. They had access. Mark's name was still on the account as secondary after Patrick's death. I'd never thought to remove it. The kettle on the stove began to whistle, though I couldn't remember turning it on. I shut it off, leaning heavily on the counter. In my head, pieces began to lock together: the sudden talk of redecorating, the not your house comment, the property transfer papers, the missing money. It wasn't carelessness. It was a plan. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the kitchen window. The lake beyond was frozen solid, white under the weak sun. This house, this place, it had been my life's work. And now, quietly, they were dismantling it. I thought of Patrick's voice again, that porch conversation before he passed. "Don't let them take what we built, Maggie." I straightened, smoothed my hands over the countertop. On the surface, nothing in me had changed. But inside, I began to draw a new map, every account, every down, every asset I still held. They wanted it all. I would know exactly what all meant before they ever suspected. By mid-January, the calls had stopped. At first, I told myself everyone was busy, post-holiday slump, cold weather, school starting back up for Hannah. But the silence stretched, each day a little heavier. I'd see cars in the driveway at Mark's house when I drove past on my way to the market. Once, through the frosted glass of their front window, I caught the glow of candles and a dozen silhouettes gathered around the table. A birthday, maybe. I kept driving. No invitation, no explanation. The neighborhood grapevine worked just fine without me. Mrs. Taylor from 2 houses down mentioned that wonderful New Year's dinner at Mark's. Apparently, Eliza had made lamb and everyone raved about it. I smiled, nodded, and pretended I'd been out of town. The truth sat like a stone in my stomach. Even the smaller things changed. The book club we used to attend together. Eliza went alone now. Sunday brunch with the cousins. Moved to a more convenient time I could never make. The family group chat went quiet on my phone, though I'd see new photos posted online. The one thread left was Hannah. She called late one evening, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. Nana, I can't talk long. Mom doesn't like me calling. My throat tightened. I'm glad you did. She told me about school, about the snow fort she and her friends built in the yard. Then her tone shifted. They had a meeting with some man at the house today. He had a briefcase. Did you catch his name? I asked, keeping my voice light. Something with an L. Lawson, maybe? He looked serious. Lawson? I filed it away. There was a Lawson and Price law office in town, the same firm on the envelope I'd found. Hannah kept talking, but my mind spun. Another piece on the board. Weeks passed. The isolation deliberate now. I'd leave voicemails that went unanswered. Once, Mark picked up, his voice brisk. We're just swamped, Mom. We'll catch up soon. Click. The house felt larger, emptier. The ticking of the kitchen clock seemed louder in the evenings. I kept busy, sorting old photographs, polishing the silverware I hadn't used in years, but it was busy work. One afternoon I sat on the porch, bundled in my thick wool coat, watching the lake under a sky the color of pewter. A text buzzed in my lap. From Hannah, they're talking about spring renovations. Mom says you might not be here by then. I stared at the words until the cold numbed my fingers. The wind off the lake was sharp, but inside me, something sharper took root. I thought of every holiday I'd hosted, every night I'd stayed up to make sure Mark had a lunch for school, every time I'd chosen their comfort over my own. And now they were racing me, room by room, plan by plan. Hannah sent one more message before signing off. I'll come over this weekend. Don't tell. That weekend she arrived in a flurry of snowflakes and teenage energy, shaking off her coat. We made cocoa, sat at the kitchen table. She told me about overhearing her parents arguing. Eliza pushing to get it done before summer. Mark hesitated, worried about backlash. Backlash from who? I asked. Hannah's eyes met mine. You. I reached across the table, squeezed her hand. Thank you for telling me. We didn't talk about it again. We baked cookies instead, the smell of sugar and butter filling the kitchen. But the words lingered in the air, warm and dangerous. That night after she left, I stood by the window watching the lake turn silver under the moonlight. The frost on the glass caught the light like shards. They thought they'd shut me out, left me in the dark. They forgot I can still see in the dark. The country club's banquet hall smelled faintly of lemon polish and overcooked salmon. Strings of white lights draped from the rafters, flickering gently, and the low hum of conversation filled the air. It was Uncle Robert's 70th birthday, and nearly every branch of the family tree was there. I had debated coming. Mark's voice on the phone had been flat when he invited me, as if it were a formality, but Hannah had begged. Please, Nana, it won't be the same without you. I walked in carrying my usual peace offering, a double-layer chocolate cake, the recipe Patrick had loved. The room was warm, the air thick with perfume and laughter. For a moment, I let myself believe it could be fine. Eliza was at the far end of the room in a red dress that caught every light. She spotted me, her smile thin. Margaret, you came. Of course, I said, setting the cake on the dessert table. Her eyes flicked to the cake stand, then to me. Oh, we already have dessert catered. But thank you. I glanced at the glossy white frosted confections lined up neatly. Mine looked homemade, because it was. The difference felt like a line drawn in sugar. The seating chart sealed it. My name wasn't at the family table near the front. Instead, I was tucked into a corner table with distant cousins I hadn't seen in years. From my seat, the speeches were a blur, laughter rolling over me like I wasn't there. During dinner, Eliza floated from table to table, pausing at ours just long enough to lean down and say, I hope the salmon's not too dry for you, Margaret. Older taste buds can be sensitive. A few heads turned. I forced a small smile. Inside, I was steadying the knife of her words. Between courses, I went to the restroom. On my way back, I passed the catering station. Two staffers talking in low voices. Lawson's coming by next week to finalize the paperwork, one said, stacking empty plates. Which one's Lawson? The other asked. The lawyer. For that lake house thing. Eliza wants it done before spring. I kept walking, my face calm, heart pounding. A direct confirmation handed to me over a pile of dirty dishes. Back at my table, the cake I'd brought was gone from the dessert table. I spotted it. Half hidden near the kitchen door, a single slice missing. Hannah caught my eye from across the room, lifting her fork in a tiny salute. When the toast began, Mark took the mic. I just want to thank everyone for coming tonight, especially Eliza for organizing everything. She's the glue of this family. The room clapped. I felt the heat rise in my face. Not from jealousy, but from the erasure. No mention of the years I'd hosted every holiday, the times I'd covered bills when Robert's business faltered. Then Eliza stepped up. And let's give my mother-in-law credit. She made it here tonight despite the weather. We were worried, weren't we, Mark? At her age, driving at night can be risky. A ripple of polite laughter. I lifted my glass, meeting her eyes across the room. Thank you for your concern. My tone was smooth, unshaken. She blinked just once. The speeches droned on, plates were cleared, music started. I slipped out onto the terrace for air. The night was cold, the stars sharp against the black sky. From inside came the muffled bass of a pop song I didn't recognize. In the quiet, I pulled out my phone and typed one word into my notes: Lawson. Underlined twice. I stayed until the end, smiling for photos, thanking Robert. But as I stepped into the night air toward my car, my mind was already ahead. Thinking of that lawyer, the timing, the next step. They thought tonight had put me in my place. They were right. Just not the place they imagined. The house was silent when I returned from the banquet. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator broke the stillness. I hung my coat by the door, but kept my shoes on. Tonight wasn't for settling in. I went straight to the study. The oak desk sat in its usual place by the window, the drawers full of bills, letters, and scraps of everyday life. But my eyes were on the low cabinet against the far wall, the one Patrick had built into the paneling, a plain brass keyhole, unassuming unless you knew it was there. I pulled the small tin from the top shelf, shook it until the old key slid into my palm. The lock gave a stiff click. The door swung open to reveal the dark metal face of the safe. My heart thudded in my ears. I hadn't opened it in years, not since I'd tucked away the last of Patrick's paperwork after the funeral. The combination came back like muscle memory: the date we bought the house, the day Hannah was born, the month Patrick proposed. The handle turned. The door opened with a low groan. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and metal. Folders stacked neatly, a few small boxes, an envelope with my name in Patrick's handwriting. I reached for the envelope first. The paper was thick, the ink slightly faded. Maggie, it began. If you're reading this, it means I'm not there to remind you myself. The house is yours. We built it with our hands, and no one, not even family, has the right to take it without your say. The deed is here, along with accounts I never touched in case you needed them. Don't let anyone rush you. Hold your ground. I traced the letters with my finger. His voice was in every curve, steady and sure. Beneath the letter was the deed to the house. Original, with both our signatures and the county seal. No transfer, no lien, nothing to weaken my claim. Next came the investment portfolio. I remembered Patrick talking about a little something on the side, back in the 90s, but I'd never asked. The statements told the story, a diversified mix, all in my name. The current value made my breath catch. Enough to buy another house outright, enough to live without ever touching the lake house. In a smaller folder, I found correspondence from the same law firm that had mailed the transfer, papers to Mark, Lawson and Price. Only these were addressed to Patrick and me, acknowledging my sole ownership after his passing. They'd been trying to use my own law firm to take what was mine. I sat back on my heels, the safe door still open. The study smelled of old pine and dust, the radiator clicking as it cooled. Lifting one of the small boxes, I found our wedding rings inside. Patrick's band smooth with wear, mine catching the light. Beneath them, a tiny brass key I didn't recognize. I set it aside, mind already whirring. If it belonged to another lock in the house, it might hold more answers. One by one, I laid the documents on the desk, making a neat stack. Deed to the lake house, investment portfolio in my name, letters from Patrick, legal confirmation of ownership. I stared at them, the weight of both memory and leverage settling in my hands. Upstairs, the wind rattled the bedroom windows. I thought of Mark and Eliza, sitting in their warm living room. Certain they were weeks away from sealing my fate, they had no idea the ground under them had already shifted. I slid everything back into the safe, except the deed and Patrick's letter. Those I placed in a new envelope and tucked into the false bottom of my desk drawer. The small brass key went into my pocket. Tomorrow I'd find the locket fit. The clock on my nightstand glowed 1:07 a.m. I lay on my back, eyes fixed on the dark ceiling, the weight of the safe's contents pressing harder than any quilt. The wind off the lake moaned against the eaves, a low, restless sound that matched my pulse. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Liz's smile at the banquet, heard the catering staff say Lawson's name, felt the cool edge of Patrick's letter in my hands. I turned onto my side. The mattress dipped, familiar after years alone. but tonight it felt like a ledge. Patrick's voice was clear in my head. "Hold your ground, Maggie. Don't let them take it." I'd always thought he meant, as the house. Now I knew better. It was everything: my work, my history, my place. The radiator hissed. Somewhere in the walls, the pipes groaned. I got up. Sleep was a stranger tonight. In the kitchen, I filled the kettle, the tap water running cold over my fingers. I made tea the way Patrick used to, strong, with a splash of milk. The steam curled up, warming my face, but the knots in my chest didn't ease. I took my cup to the dining table, pushed aside the placemats, and set down a yellow legal pad. The pen felt solid in my hand. Step 1. Secure all documents. The deed and Patrick's letter were already hidden in the desk's false bottom. Tomorrow, the investment portfolio would go into a safe deposit box at the bank. Step 2. When I find out everything Lawson knows. If Mark and Eliza thought they could slide a property transfer past me, they'd need signatures. I wouldn't give them mine, but I needed to know their timeline, their arguments. Step 3A. Remove access to all accounts. That joint savings account with Mark's secondary authorization was first. Close it. Transfer the funds to a new account in my name only. Step 4A. Identify allies. Hannah was my quiet lifeline, but she was just a child. I needed someone with legal teeth. I remembered Helen Brooks from church. Her son was a lawyer in Madison. Step 5D. Keep my face neutral. Whatever I learned, whatever I did, they couldn't suspect. Not yet. The list grew bullet by bullet until the page was nearly full. I sat back, the tea now cold, and read it twice. The brass key was still in my pocket. I took it out, turned it over in my palm. Small, worn, with a faint engraving 4B. I couldn't place it, not for any lock I knew in the house. Patrick had been a man who believed in compartments, literal and otherwise. If there was a 4B, it meant something. I carried the key to the study, switched on the desk lamp. The warm light spread over the old oak, the stack of unpaid utility bills, the framed photo of Patrick holding a much younger Mark on the dock. I searched the room methodically, drawers, file cabinets, even behind the bookshelf where dust clung to my fingertips. No 4B. It was nearly 3 a.m. when I gave up and returned to bed. The key lay on the nightstand, catching a stripe of moonlight through the curtains. I lay there, listening to the ice shift on the lake. In my mind, I replayed the last few months like a film. Eliza's sidelong glances, the missing money, the seating chart at the banquet. And over it all, Patrick's words, steady and unyielding. Somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, I realized they'd underestimated the one thing I'd never lost: my memory. I remembered everything they wanted to erase, and I would use it. The first light of dawn seeped through the curtains, gray and cold. I swung my legs out of bed, feet finding the wool slippers. The key was cool in my palm. Today, I'd find where it fit. I started with the bank. Monday morning, I dressed in my navy wool coat and practical boots, the kind that didn't slip on the icy sidewalks. To anyone passing, I looked like a woman running errands, maybe picking up groceries. Inside First County Bank, the air was warm, scented faintly of toner and floor polish. "Good morning, Mrs. Doyle," the teller said. She'd known me for years. "I need to close a joint account," I said, sliding my ID across. My voice was calm, almost casual. "And open a new one in my name only." She tapped at her keyboard. "Ending balance will be issued as a cashier's check. Is that all right?" "Perfect." I watched as the numbers appeared on the screen, the exact amount minus those 2 unauthorized withdrawals. Still, it was enough to matter. I took the check, folded it into my wallet, and felt a weight shift in my chest. One door closed. Next, the safe deposit box. The bank manager led me down a quiet hallway, unlocking a heavy door that swung inward with a muffled creak. The small metal box slid forward easily. Inside, I placed the deed, Patrick's letter, and the investment portfolio statements. My fingers lingered on the letter for a moment before I shut the lid. Locked away out of reach from anyone but me. By noon, I was walking back to my car under a pale winter sun. Step 2. Find out exactly what Lawson knew. I didn't call his office, not yet. Instead, I phoned Helen Brooks. We met at the church the next afternoon under the pretense of organizing the choir's Easter music. Helen was in her 70s, sharp-eyed and discreet. Over coffee in the empty fellowship hall, I told her the bare bones: property papers, pressure from Mark and Eliza, my suspicion about Lawson. Her brows drew together. "My son David will meet you. He specializes in property law." She scribbled his number on the back of a hymn sheet. "Don't call from your home phone." That evening, I used the public phone at the library to arrange a meeting. David's voice was warm but direct. "Bring every document you have. We'll make sure nothing changes without your consent." The rest of the week, I moved like a woman on autopilot. I still baked muffins for the church sale, still waved at neighbors from my porch, still answered Mark's rare texts with polite brevity. But underneath, every hour was a step in the plan. I sorted decades of files, shredding anything useless, keeping only what could shield me. I changed the passwords on my email and online banking. I made a list of every asset, down to the silver tea set in the dining room. Friday morning, I found myself back in the study, the brass key in my palm, 4B. I'd turned the house upside down looking for a match, but nothing fit. On a whim, I drove to the storage facility 2 towns over, the one Patrick had rented years ago when we cleared out his father's workshop. I'd forgotten we still had it. The bill paid automatically every January. The manager recognized me. Units the same as always, 4B. Haven't seen you here in a while, 40B. The lock was small, the brass key sliding in with a satisfying click. The metal door rolled up, the sound echoing in the concrete hallway. Inside, dust motes floated in the cold light from the single bulb. Stacks of boxes lined the walls labeled in Patrick's handwriting. Tools, summer gear, old files. I stepped inside, the air dry and tinged with the faint scent of cedar. Somewhere in here was another layer of what he'd left me. I pulled the door down behind me. Whatever I found here would be the next move. The unit smelled faintly of machine oil and cedar. My breath puffed white in the cold air as I prayed open a box marked Old Files. Inside, tucked between tax returns from the 80s and a stack of yellowed letters, was a flat, fireproof envelope. I slid it open with my house key. Out slid a second notarized deed to the lake house, dated after Patrick's death, reaffirming my sole ownership. Alongside it, a certified statement from the county clerk noting there were no encumbrances, liens, or pending claims. Underneath, a folder stamped confidential held something even more valuable, a complete record of Patrick's investment accounts, all in my name, updated through the year he died. The totals were staggering. More than enough to make me untouchable. The last item stopped me cold. It was a signed letter from Patrick to Lawson & Price, instructing them to act only on my direct, written orders for any property matters. Dated. Witnessed. Still valid. I closed the folder, my pulse steady. This was no longer just defense. This was ammunition. 2 weeks later, Mark called. His tone was brighter than usual. We need you to come into Lawson's office. Just a formality for some updates. I agreed instantly. The day was bright but bitterly cold. I wore my gray wool dress. The one Patrick always said made me look like a woman who knows her mind. In my tote bag, the folder from 4B rested beneath a neatly folded scarf. Lawson's office was warm, the carpet thick underfoot. Mark and Eliza were already seated at the polished oak conference table, their smiles practiced. A thin stack of papers sat in front of my chair. Margaret, Lawson said smoothly, this is just to formalize the transfer we discussed. Nothing complicated. I glanced at the top page. Transfer of property agreement. The same one I'd seen months ago, only now the date and signature lines were filled in. With today's date and my name left blank, I set the papers aside. Before we begin, I have a few documents you might want to see. From my tote, I slid out the notarized deed, the county statement, the investment portfolio summary, and Patrick's letter to Lawson & Price. I laid them in a neat row across the table. Lawson's brows knit. He picked up the letter, read, and sat back slowly. Mark leaned forward. What is this? This, I said evenly, is proof that I own the lake house outright. This, I tapped the letter, is your lawyer's acknowledgement that no action can be taken without my written consent, which you will never have. Eliza's smile flickered. Margaret, we just thought. You thought I wouldn't notice withdrawals from my account. You thought I wouldn't see the papers you had drafted behind my back, and you thought, wrongly, that I was too old, too soft, to fight. The room went very still. Outside, a snowplow scraped along the street. Mark's voice was tight. So what now? Now, I said, I'm closing every door you tried to wedge open. The accounts in my name are secure. The deed is locked away, and you will not be stepping foot in my home unless invited. Eliza crossed her arms. You can't just. I can. And I have. Lawson cleared his throat. Given these documents, there's no legal basis to proceed with the transfer. Mark's jaw worked, but no words came out. I stood, gathering my papers. We're done here. On my way out, I paused by the door. One more thing, you might want to check your own accounts. Money has a way of disappearing when trust is broken. Their eyes followed me, but neither spoke. The air outside was sharp, but I felt lighter than I had in months. Each breath tasted clean. At home, I hung my coat, set my tote on the desk, and looked out at the lake. The ice was beginning to crack in long, thin lines, the first signs of spring. Justice, I thought, can be quiet. And sometimes quiet is the loudest sound in the room. The phone stayed silent for days. No clipped texts from Mark. No perfunctory check-ins from Eliza. The space where their voices used to live was now just air, and I found I could breathe in it. I spent the first morning after the meeting walking the lake path. The ice was pulling back from the shore, revealing dark water that caught the pale sunlight. The wind was cold, but it carried no weight. At the general store, Mrs. Taylor mentioned she hadn't seen Mark's car around much. I just smiled. He's busy, I suppose. In truth, I knew exactly why they were scarce. The look on Mark's face at Lawson's office was the look of someone who'd had the map snatched from his hands and realized the road ahead was gone. Hannah came by the next Saturday, cheeks flushed from the cold. She stomped snow from her boots and slipped into the kitchen like she belonged there, which she did. We baked muffins, the smell of cinnamon and butter filling the air. Over tea, she told me, Mom and Dad aren't talking much. Dad spends a lot of time in the garage. Mom's just mad. Mad at what? I asked gently. Hannah shrugged. At Dad. At everything, I guess. I reached over, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Sometimes when people lose control of something, they look for someone to blame. She nodded, eyes down on her mug. I don't care. I like it here better. The days stretched into a quiet rhythm. I mended the quilt on the guest bed, sorted through old photographs, keeping only the ones that mattered, packed 2 boxes of things for the church thrift sale. Each evening, I'd sit by the living room window with a book, watching the lake change under the light. Gray at dawn, silver at midday, deep blue just before dark. There was peace in the routine, but it was the peace of a place you know you'll leave. The lake house had been my anchor for decades, but now it felt like the last chapter of a book I'd already finished. One afternoon, I took out the brass key again. It no longer held mystery. It had already given me what I needed. But holding it reminded me that hidden doors exist everywhere if you're willing to look. That evening, over soup, I told Hannah, I'm thinking about moving. Her spoon paused. We're somewhere smaller, maybe nearer to town, somewhere I can walk to the market and the library. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, when I'm old enough, can I come live with you? I smiled. The door will always be open. March brought the first G's back to the lake. I watched them skim across the thawing water, their calls carrying on the wind. Mark never called. Eliza sent one email, 2 sentences about some distant cousin's wedding. I replied with a polite wish for a nice celebration. Nothing more. The ties weren't cut with a bang, but with the quiet snip of a thread pulled free. On the last day of the month, I called a realtor. I'd like to discuss listing my property, I said. My voice was steady. The lake would belong to someone else soon. My next view would be different. Maybe a garden, maybe a street lined with maples. Whatever it was, it would be mine, and this time, no one would take it from me. The new house sat at the end of a quiet street lined with maple trees, their early spring buds just starting to blush green. It was smaller than the lake house, but the sun poured in through the front windows each morning, warming the wooden floors. The first week, I unpacked slowly, letting each item find its place. Patrick's letter went in the top drawer of my desk. The brass key hung on a hook by the kitchen door, not because I needed it anymore, but because it reminded me that even the smallest things can unlock something big. On Saturday, Hannah arrived with a backpack and a carton of fresh strawberries from the farmer's market. We made shortcake together, the kitchen filling with the smell of warm biscuits and sweet fruit. Afterward, we sat on the porch, plates balanced on our laps. The street was quiet except for the occasional bicycle bell or the rustle of wind in the trees. I like it here, she said. It feels free. I smiled. That's the point. In the afternoons, I walked to the library, a brick building with tall arched windows. The librarian learned my name on the second visit. I started a small community group there, book exchanges, tea, and a place for anyone who needed a calm corner. One rainy day, Hannah and I sorted through an old box from the lake house. Among the photographs and postcards, we found a small notebook of Patrick's, half grocery lists, half musings about the future. On the last page, he'd written, "Leave the door open for those who come after you." I read it aloud, my throat tightening. Hannah slipped her hand into mine. We didn't talk about Mark and Eliza much anymore. Some stories don't need retelling to be remembered. The distance was enough. By summer, The garden out front was a riot of zinnias and lavender. Neighbors stopped to chat, some bringing clippings from their own yards. My days had a rhythm: coffee at the table by the window, letters answered in the afternoon, and Hannah's laughter filling the kitchen whenever she visited. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Hannah asked, "Do you ever miss the lake?" I looked toward the horizon where the rooftops met the sky. "I miss what it was, not what it became." She nodded, understanding more than her age should allow. The night settled in, the scent of lavender drifting through the open window. I thought of the long path here, the words that tried to cut me down, the quiet plans the moment justice found its voice. And I realized the house, the accounts, the papers, those were just tools. The real victory was standing here now, my life in my own hands, the next chapter already in motion. I turned to Hannah. "Whatever comes next, we face it with our heads high." She grinned. "Just like you did. We sat there until the porch light flicked on, the air cooling around us. This was home. If someone ever tried to erase your place in your own family, how would you respond? Would you stay silent to keep the peace, or stand your ground no matter the cost? Share your story, because your voice matters and you're not alone."